Hi, this is On the Level and I'm Fergus Thompson, and today we're in eastern Beijing to speak to Professor Daniel A. Bell about Confucianism in China today. Professor Daniel Bell, welcome to On the Level. Now you are a Canadian, or Canadien, born in Montreal. You were educated at McGill University in Canada and at Oxford in England. You've spent most of the last 20 years here in Asia. Currently you're a professor at Tsinghua University here in Beijing of ethics and political philosophy. You've also taught in Hong Kong and Singapore, and you've written a number of books on Chinese politics, 4 books in fact, including the Beyond Liberal Democracy and your latest book, China's New Confucianism. You also write for a number of publications, including The Guardian in the UK, and you have had op-eds published in the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, and the Toronto Globe and Mail. Now, as we can gather from the title of your book there, China's New Confucianism, your research interests are Confucianism and its relevance to China politics today and to everyday life. Can I ask you first, perhaps a simple, perhaps not so simple question, religion, moral philosophy, political stance, what is Confucianism?
Well, it's a very wide and diverse tradition, and there's an argument about whether it's a religion or not. But what interests me in particular is its relevance for everyday life and politics in China. And it's quite striking that 30 years ago, or let's say during the Cultural Revolution, it would have been literally life-threatening to try to think of the contemporary relevance of Confucianism in a positive way. And now, quite the other way around, there's this revival happening at different levels of society, including at the very top. So,
while there is this debate of religion or political philosophy, you would go along the lines of its application as a political system.
Yeah, as a political system and as a kind of influence on everyday social life and the rituals that are part of social life. I'm not against it being a religion, but I personally, I think that Confucianism is more of a social and political ethic, and that to address the more kind of metaphysical questions like the meaning of suffering or life after death, personally I think other traditions might have more to offer in that respect. Yeah.
Now, the Western view, or let's say perhaps the American view of Confucianism might see it as certainly somewhat exotic, perhaps authoritarian, and perhaps maybe impractical in today's modern society. What would you say to that view?
Well, as an ethic, I don't think it's exotic at all. I think if anything, it's the closest to our everyday understanding of morality, because Confucianism is very diverse, but I think all interpretations share the view that the good life lies in social relations, starting with the family and then extending to non-family members. And the further you go away from the family, it's important to extend love, but the more the love decreases in intensity. And I think this is how, perhaps as an everyday ethic, I think it's very common, not just in East Asia, but elsewhere. So I don't think it's exotic at all. Whether it's authoritarian, again, that depends on how it's interpreted. And there have been many strands, and it's been linked with legalism, which is the other main political tradition in China, which is not the rule of law, it's more the rule by law, using harsh punishments to have social order in society. But you have other interpretations of Confucianism that point to the fact that it is a kind of hierarchical ethic, meaning that it's a recognition that in everyday life there's going to be certain hierarchies, parents and children and so on, but that those who are who have more status also have more responsibilities, and they have to care and show concern for those who have less status. And also that, for example, a teacher-student relation, of course a teacher has more knowledge in that sense, almost by definition, why else would he or she be a teacher? But the student has an obligation to question. And and even Confucius, he set the model with his best student called Yanhui, and he was very critical of Yanhui for never asking questions, and so that Confucius himself can't improve, because the teacher also has. Confucianism is a constant quest for self-improvement, and the only way to do that is by constantly questioning one's ordinary way of doing things. And whether it's students or children, all have an obligations to do that. There's this great Qing dynasty text, maybe 150 years ago, called Di Zi Gui, and it's still used today to teach children about everyday ethics. And then there's this question, it's addressed to 7 or 8 year old kids, what if your parent does something wrong, what do you do? So then the text says, well, first you have to criticize them, you know, show where they're wrong, and then if that doesn't work, then you cry, use emotions. So it's very detailed. And then if that doesn't work, then you have to submit to your parents, you know, which is not unreasonable advice for a young kid, right?
Right. So you're saying, but it's a two-way hierarchy, that there are obligations in both directions according to this.
Right.
Now you mentioned legalism there, which people would think is, as you said, a harsh way of dealing with society. Confucianism, has there been a mixture of legalism and over the two have been beside each other for 2,000 years?
Right. Well, you know, the first emperor, the one who, you know, Qin Huangdi, about 2,200 years ago, he was explicitly inspired by legalism, and he's the one who unified China after a period of chaos, and used very harsh means to do so, you know, including he buried Confucian scholars alive with their books, and, you know, he started to build the Great Wall. He unified the measurements and the script and so on. But that was a very short-lived dynasty. It was very brutal. But then the next dynasty, the Han Dynasty, explicitly, you know, gradually became more officially Confucian. But it had some legalist elements, meaning that, you know, Confucianism is a political ethic, but it doesn't have much guidance for how to provide social order in a large political, you know, setting, and legalism might have more to offer in that respect. So it became mixed for the next 2,000 years.
As you say there, Confucianism doesn't have that specific speciality of dealing with, as you say, large societies. For example, let's talk about China now. I know that in much of your writing, you feel that in the view from the West, and by the West we're talking about Western liberal democratic countries, is that liberal democracy should be imposed or by some means introduced into Asia, and that you feel that this is not a good idea, whether it's the United States version or the Scandinavian version. Why does liberal democracy not suit East Asia?
Well, I mean, it's not that it doesn't suit. It just means that there is room to, I mean, it's very important to allow for East Asian traditions, including Confucianism, to shape social and political reform. I mean, one thing in the 20th century in China, whether it was Marxists or liberals, they all thought that, I mean, of course there were many exceptions, but overall the trend was that we have to modernize, we have to become Western. Meaning we have to adopt Western political structures and a Western style of organizing the economy. And there were arguments about that, but the idea that you could draw upon Chinese traditions to shape modernity was really a non-starter. But in the past, let's say since the early 90s, now people are saying, well, hold on a second. You know, now China has developed, or is developing rapidly, partly on the basis of its own values, and maybe it shares something with other East Asian countries with a Confucian heritage that might be appropriate and for modernity, and that might shape modernity in different ways. So let's allow for that possibility. So again, it's not a rejection of liberal democracy, but it's saying that, you know, we can have, in a way it's a more open-minded attitude to China's own traditions. Now, in some ways, there may be no direct conflict with liberal democratic values. Like, I think most Confucians value more freedom of political speech, because obviously if you want to improve the status quo, you need to have more freedom of speech to do so. You know, but there's some areas where there might be important differences. Like, for example, in a liberal democratic political structure.
Just to clarify, you're talking about differences between a Confucianist system and a liberal democratic system.
Right. You know, as you know, the way to choose the top political leaders is by a voting system, and at the end of the day, the political leaders, they owe their allegiance to the voters, and I mean, that's, if it works well, you know, then the voters get their interests represented and articulated in the system, which is good, but it's still a limited way of thinking about politics, because Confucians say that political leaders, they should not just look after one group of people. They should look after everyone who's affected by the policies of the government. I mean, Confucians use this language of tianxia, which means all under heaven. So that means that political leaders have the task of representing not just voters, but also non-voters who are affected by the policies of the government, including future generations and people living outside of, for example, of China, who are affected by the policies of the Chinese government. I mean, think of global warming. nobody in the political system, whether it's China or the US, represents the interests of future generations who are affected by global warming. So Confucians say, instead of, like in the Middle East, I mean, it seems as though, I mean, it's wonderful to have all these reforms, but it seems that the only alternative in place, like to as a political system, is to the kind of authoritarian status quo, is to have elections for leaders. But Confucians say that's limited. We also need to have representation for non-voters, like future generations. No political system has that. But Confucians say, so that's why. So you have some Confucian reformers, like this scholar called Jiang Qing. He proposes. He proposes actually a tricameral legislature.
So just to explain, Jiang Qing is he's written about Confucianism, a text in it which is one of the standard texts. Would you say at this day?
Well, it's a very influential work on political Confucianism.
Right. And he's putting forward a practical theory of running a state along Confucianist lines.
Right.
Okay.
And there's an argument over whether to what extent it's really Confucian, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much if we think it's a good idea. But basically, he proposes a lower house, which is kind of democratic, where you use a voting system to choose the leaders, and the leaders represent the interests of the voters. But he also proposes this other house, where the leaders would represent the interests of non-voters who are affected by the policies of government, for example, future generations and people living outside of China. And for that, obviously, you can't use voting system to choose those leaders because they have the explicit task representing non-voters. So here Confucianism has this tradition of political meritocracy, which is that everybody should have an equal opportunity to be educated, or to put it in modern terms, and to participate in politics, but at some level, not everybody is going to emerge from that process with equal ability to make morally informed political judgments. So an important task of politics is to choose those with above average ability and moral insight.
Or that they choose themselves by excelling in specific areas and tasks. But what should they excel in? Because under the original imperial exams, a lot of rote learning of the classics,
sure,
that's not going to help today. What sort of meritocracy are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. But even in Imperial China, there were debates about the nature of the examinations. And there were some Confucians, like this 17th century scholar called Huang Zhongxi, who criticized the excessive emphasis on rote memorization. He says we need to test for more independent thought and more interpretation. So I think examinations are important because arguably, it's perhaps the least bad system to choose, people with above average. People say about democracy, like the famous
It's
quote.
also said it's the least bad system.
Yeah, that's the famous quote from Winston Churchill that it's a horrible system, but all the others are even worse. Well, maybe you could say the same thing about examinations for choosing those with above average ability. But of course, the examinations would have to be modified. And so the Confucians say it's important to test knowledge of the classics because they really focus on what it means to be a good political ruler, and there's lots of insights to learn from that. There's a new book by, it's published by Princeton called The Myth of the Rational Voter, and it's written by an economist, and he shows that that it's not, the problem is not just that voters are selfish, that represent their interests. The problem is that they don't understand basic economics, and so therefore they don't even get their own interests right. So he proposes tests of voter competence that would test basic economic knowledge. Now in the US it's a non-starter, but in China, it's possible. So the test would have, some of the Confucian classics, basic economic knowledge, knowledge of international relations, because remember, this house of government would have the explicit task of representing future generations and people living outside of China.
This is the second of these
right.
rooms you're saying. So,
right.
So you've the elected people democratically, you've got this meritocratic house. Is there another one then?
Well, this is the thing about Confucianism, is that it's normally, I think, tolerance and is really part of it's a core, let's say, part of the tradition. As opposed to, like, if you think of the monotheistic religions, and the warfare they've had over who represents the truth. I mean, Confucianism has historically, learned through its interaction with different traditions, with Taoism, with Buddhism, with legalism, and now with liberalism, and also with Christianity. So even Jiang Qing, this guy who's regarded as the most kind of hardcore, I'm trying to think of...
Don't use the word fundamentalist?
Yeah, well, that's what his critics say, but this House of Government shows that it's not accurate, because this third house of government would have the explicit task representing different traditions in China. Because the past 100 years in China, it's not just Confucianism that has been, subject to attack by, both liberals and Marxists, but other traditions too. So he argues this house government would be composed of deputies that represent different traditions, including Taoism, including Buddhism, including Christianity. So it's a bit.
So this is sort of an appointed elite coming from various sectors of society.
Right, exactly. Yeah, maybe closer to like the Zhangxie today, the CPPCC.
Right. Bringing it up to date, you said moving towards this would be easier in China than in the United States because we're starting from a different point. Now, at the moment, the Communist Party of China runs the country here, obviously. How do you see their adoption of Confucianism taking place at the moment? It's gone from being, as you said, not a very good idea to be Confucianist in the Cultural Revolution, to whereby they have almost adopted Confucianism as a symbol of China.
Right. I mean, the Communist Party is a big organization, over 78 million people. And you still have many elderly cadres who are trained in this Maoist ethic, of antipathy to tradition. But many of the younger cadres in their 40s and 50s are really interested. And there are debates in party schools about, what's common between the socialist traditions and the Confucian traditions and what they could learn from each other. And Confucianism is being taught more and more in schools, and sometimes it's through the formal system, sometimes in more informal experiments. And the most striking symbol of how Confucianism is becoming more, accepted in a kind of official capacity is this huge statue, 9-meter statue of Confucius, right near Tiananmen Square. Because, Beijing, as you know, has changed so much the past 30 years, but Tiananmen Square is such an important symbol of political space, and whatever happens there really shows that this is what the party kind of believes in. And the only change in the past 30 years has been this huge statue of Confucius, which has been put on a couple of years ago. So it's moving towards a more official embrace of Confucianism.
But is this, as you say, official embrace, but is this embrace from the heart, or there would be people who say that the Communist Party is using Confucianism as a tool for its own ends, to present itself in a certain way, to say that, well, look, this is a particularly Chinese characteristic, we are identified with certain elements of Confucianism, therefore it suits us to use it.
Sure.
Is there any validity to that?
Of course, yeah. And Confucianism is like other traditions where it can and is often misused by political elites for their own purposes. But there are many within the party who are sincerely committed to Confucian values, and that's another reason why it's important to have freedom of speech, because it's important to allow social critics to point to the gap between the ideals and the reality and the misuses of the ideals. So that's why I think in this sense Confucians side with liberals in saying that more freedom of political speech is important in China, precisely to prevent or to expose misuses to the extent that they do occur.
So under a system like this that Jiang Qing or you are suggesting, freedom of speech and rule of law would be important elements, much as they are in liberal democracy?
Well, the rule of law would be different, because Confucians say that, how do we deal with social conflicts? And the most important thing is to preserve social harmony. And how do you do that? Well, when you have conflicts, the first thing we should do is use mechanisms that don't further, undermine social relations. So, for example, if spouses have a conflict, how do you deal with it? Well, Confucians would say, first they should go through mediation, and maybe a year or two later, then they have the right to divorce, but not instant divorce. Or when there's a conflict between workers and bosses, again, we should rely on more informal mechanisms that don't really that do not undermine social harmony or social trust.
So you're saying a way of solving these problems by going through mediation rather than confrontation?
Right, mediation and ritual. Again, in English it sounds bad, but in Chinese, if you say 礼制, it doesn't sound so bad. But some
so
sort
just explain ritual there. What
okay, well, ritual. It really. The best Confucian thinker on ritual is Xunzi, and he was writing again over 2,000 years ago. And he says that ritual has a very important function in terms of limiting desires, especially the desires of those with power, because they're the ones we have to worry about. So for example, if you have, for example, in a village drinking ceremony, they're always going to be hierarchical, he says, So meaning that those who are more senior have drink first, but eventually everybody in the village participates in the ceremony, and then a sense of community develops within that setting, and it prevents social conflicts from going out, and it means that those with more social power will look after the interests of those with less social power. So in a modern, for example, so let's update it a little bit or a lot. In a modern company, it would mean, like, how do big companies in South Korea and Japan, and not to growing extent in China, how do they preserve a social harmony, so to speak? Or how do they look after the interests of workers? Well, often the laws are not, but they don't have very strong union laws. But the bosses of the companies would eat together with the workers, or they would go and sing karaoke together. And it's hierarchical rituals, meaning like the boss would sing first and get more applause. But eventually everybody participates, and then common feeling develops. And in hard economic times, the boss is going to look after the worker, not sack them in the first resort, like often happens in Anglo-American companies. So the basic point about this is that in a Confucian framework, the rule of law comes as a last resort. It's there because we need to have it, because these informal mechanisms, whether it's mediation or ritual, don't always work. But they should be kept as a last resort, not as a first resort when it comes to dealing with social problems. First, we need to think of informal ways of dealing with social conflict.
Is that not already applied here to a certain extent in China today? For example, if you get into a minor vehicle accident or some confrontation in the street, the police will come up and try to act as a mediator and say, rather than going to the police station saying you are being charged with A, B or C, they will actually start mediating and come up with some sort of a solution which is not perfect for one or the other. Is it applied? Is that
sure? I mean, it's already. I mean, yeah, and there's greater use of mediation in China in different ways, and so many of the, Western kind of trained or Western kind of legal reformers think this is not a very good thing because it undermines the rule of law, but if these informal mechanisms have the effect of protecting the interests of those with less social power, which is a big if, but if they're organized that way, and then it's better to rely on those mechanisms rather than right away going to the law to deal with social problems.
But we're looking today at the Communist Party in China today would say it represents all the people of China. At least it represents itself as representing all the people in China. It would say that the rule of law does exist, although, let's be fair, the rule of law is ignored on many occasions. And the result is that it tends to be, in this society as it is at the moment, the vulnerable and the dispossessed who suffer. If you're a grandmother trying to find out what happened to your son 20 years ago, or you're a middle-aged man who comes up against a big company in China because you want justice for your child who was poisoned, you don't get rule of law, but you don't get mediation either because you're seen as a problem. How will Confucianism address these people's worries?
Well, I mean, I think if there's more freedom of speech, including more freedom of the media, then more of those problems would be exposed. So in that sense, Confucianism has a lot to share with liberalism. And also Confucius emphasized that there's a need for independent power bases, and to check the power of those who have power. It doesn't mean that elections is the only way of doing it. For example, there could be some, for example, in this house of meritocratically chosen leaders, there could be term limits. There could be, for example, they serve for 8 years, or there could be strict anti-corruption measures. And which would include, auditing not just the deputies in the House, but the families of the deputies, because that's where a lot of the problem with corruption takes place in China. And so there are ways of dealing with these issues.
There are ways of dealing with it. It sounds pretty good. It sounds ideal. I can see the advantage of the constituencies, you say, that don't have a voice, the future of those outside. But liberal democracy sounds pretty good in theory as well. The practical applications of this in a society like China, which is, let's face it, in this day and age, morally seems a little bit hollow. Everybody's after the buck or the yuan. Can it be applied in a society where economics and capitalism seems to have taken such a hold?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, if we're comparing two ideals, I don't think liberal democracy is so ideal because it only represents voters, and there's no formal representation for non-voters. So if we're comparing two ideals, I think the Confucian one is better. If you want to look at the reality, liberal democracies, people say a better description of the American system is not one person, one vote, but $1, one vote, because capitalists have so much power to shape, the political system in their own interest. But anyway, so I mean, of course, China has many problems. And so there's different levels of different ways of dealing with the problem. So lots of some Confucians say, let's focus on the top political institutions, think of how they could be reformed. Others say, let's focus more on the educational system, so that includes Confucian values that promote a sense of greater social responsibility. I mean, that's one reason why Confucianism is being revived as well, because it's not just because China is communist, but also because of capitalism that makes people more individualistic. So there's a need to affirm more social responsibility. And where's that going to come from? Confucianism is a very rich tradition, has a lot to offer to think about how to promote social responsibility. So I think it's a natural place to go. And that's why there's so many experiments now with Confucianism in schools, precisely to deal with these problems. Now, even within a Marxist framework, the legal and political structures are bound to change along with the level of economic development. So even Marxists recognize that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when there will be a different economic structure, there's going to be different legal and political institutions. So in that sense, why can't Confucian play an important role in shaping those?
You feel because Confucianism originated in China that it is within the tradition of the people here. Do you feel that's also a reason that it would be much easier here for it to become a system accepted by people, because it's not in the blood, if you like, but in the education, in the tradition?
I think it's part of the everyday life. For example, Confucianism emphasizes filial piety. Care for elderly parents, which of course is there in the West as well, but not emphasized to the same extent. At least in Canada, once you reach the age of 18, you become independent, and you can care for your parents if you want, but it's more a matter of personal choice. But in Confucianism, it's not. You're always linked with your parents in a very deep way, and you owe obligations to them throughout your whole life. And so this view, even if it's not called Confucianism, it's still widely shared in China. So that's why, in terms of people's habits of the heart, people's everyday life, I think Confucianism resonates much more here than it would in Western countries. It's not to say that there's nothing to learn, but that I think it's more an obvious resource here. Also for the reason that you suggest, that because it came from here, people identify it more. So psychologically speaking,
you've written, perhaps half jokingly, that CPC, the Chinese or the Communist Party of China, might one day become the Confucian Party of China. Realistically, academic nicety, or this is something that realistically you see could happen in China in the long term? Confucianism going for 2,500 years. What sort of time frame?
I mean, it's possible that Confucianism would be embraced in a very official way, and certainly the trends in the past 10 to 15 years suggest a dramatic upsurge in official interest. But I think before there's some sort of official name, I mean, to a certain extent the name has to change at some point, because
you mean the name of the party?
Yeah, the name of the party, because I mean, I think there's a lot to socialist values have a lot to offer, and they have much in common with some Confucian values. The emphasis on the elimination of poverty is shared by both Confucianism and socialism. But the idea that according to Marx's theory of history, that we're in a kind of capitalist phase now, but that we're moving towards first a kind of lower form of communism and a higher form of communism, and that doesn't inspire people anymore. And I teach political theory, and there are very few students who think in this way. So there's a big problem of, let's call it, kind of ideological legitimacy, meaning that what the party calls itself, and it still promotes Marxism in an official capacity, does not correspond to people's actual political aspirations. So it has to change at some point. What's it going to change towards? It's not going to become a liberal democratic party, so what are the alternatives? Confucianism seems to be a likely one.
Let's see if it is. Daniel Bell, thank you very much for being on the level.